It's the last day of climate talks at the COP28 summit, with no agreement in sight on fossil fuels.
Israel says it's ready to continue its bombardment of Gaza for months to come as the death toll in the enclave approaches 18,000.
The European Parliament awards Mahsa Amini, the woman killed in police custody last year, sparking a women's rights movement in Iran, the Sakharov Prize.
MEPs vote for clearer labelling on honey purity and other breakfast items as the EU tries to stop counterfeit products from flooding the market.
Hopes for finishing a critical climate summit on time are fading as countries are still far apart on key issues, including an agreement on what to do about fossil fuels causing dangerous global warming. COP28 is scheduled to finish around midday, but Monday's release of a draft agreement has angered certain countries.
Ce texte, il est insuffisant. Il y a des éléments qui sont pas acceptables en l'état. C'est une déception.
The need for urgency to replace and reduce fossil fuels in the power sector in this critical decade is completely missing. The language on coal contradicts EU energy policies, and it allows for new coal power plants.
The draft calls for countries to reduce consumption and production of fossil fuels in a, quote, orderly and equitable manner. Campaigners say it's far from enough.
Saudi Arabia and other fossil fuel producing nations have pushed back, and eventually what we are seeing a language which only talks about reducing consumption and production of fossil fuels. That's unacceptable. We as civil society reject the text because we are already going through climate emergency.
A revised text is expected later Tuesday that takes into account many of the comments from participants. Final decisions by delegates have to be by consensus.
As COP28 draws to a close, a draft deal last night called for countries to reduce their consumption and production of fossil fuels. It's a conversation that's dominated talks, and while some have criticised the text in that it wasn't robust enough, calling for the phasing out of fossil fuels, COP28 President-designate Sultan Al-Jaber said it was a step in the right direction.
We have made progress, but we still have a lot to do. You know what remains to be agreed, and you know that I want you to deliver the highest ambition on all items, including on fossil fuel language.
Nations will now provide the UAE with their thoughts amid calls for multilateralism and collaboration. As the two-week summit wraps, so do the periphery events that have taken place at the many pavilions on the Expo City Dubai site. And there were congratulations for Azerbaijan for being chosen to host next year's COP29. Now all eyes will be on next year's host city and maintaining the momentum in the global fight against climate change.
The night train connecting Berlin to Brussels and Paris is running again for the first time in nearly a decade. The cooperation between the German, Austrian, French and Belgian train companies is paving the way for a more climate-friendly Europe.
Wir freuen uns, dass nach 9 Jahren es wieder einen Nachtzug nach Paris gibt. Dafür haben wir lange gekämpft als Back on Track. Und jetzt sind wir hier und können die Abfahrt des ersten Zuges begleiten.
The demand for the sleeper trains linking major European capitals has seen seats fully booked for weeks in advance.
Natürlich muss man auch beim Rollmaterial, gerade jetzt hier auf dieser neuen Relation, sehen, dass man hier in den nächsten Jahren dann auch modernere Züge bringt, um eben konkurrenzfähig zu sein zu anderen Anbietern. Und da ist man aber, denke ich, auch mit dem Nightjet der neuen Generation dann auf einem guten Weg.
Germany's Deutsche Bahn has suffered from a lack of investment, with Austrian railways far outstripping the quality of its trains.
It was a pleasant trip, so it's quite comfortable to not have to worry about catching the flights or something like that. And only disadvantage is they're slightly late occasionally, as it's today.
As demand for night services increases, train companies will be under pressure to invest in infrastructure if they want to attract more business customers.
Fall asleep in Berlin and wake up in Brussels. This year, sleeper trains are making a comeback. And with climate change dominating headlines, train companies are putting down tracks to connect European cities with one another. But will that be enough to make travelling more about the journey than the destination? Liv Stroud on the sleeper train for Euronews.
Palestinians rushed to save people trapped under the rubble in central Gaza after an Israeli airstrike. Around 18,000 people in the enclave have been killed since the war began in October, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. The vast majority of them, women and children, thousands more are believed lost under the rubble. The war and siege have also taken a heavy toll on basic services, especially healthcare. Only 14 of Gaza's 36 hospitals are functioning. The situation is all but certain to deteriorate, as Israel says that it is prepared to continue fighting for months.
סך הכל נעצרו רק בחודש האחרון יותר מ-500 מחבלים. יותר ממחציתם נלקחו להמשך חקירה בשטח ישראל.
Meanwhile, the U.S. says it is concerned about reports that Israel deployed white phosphorus munitions it provided in October in southern Lebanon.
I do think it's important to remind that white phosphorus does have a legitimate military utility in terms of illumination and producing smoke to conceal movements. And obviously, anytime that we provide items like white phosphorus to another military, it is with the full expectation that it'll be used in keeping with those legitimate purposes.
In Egypt, UN Security Council ambassadors are visiting the Rafah border crossing days after the United States vetoed a council resolution for a ceasefire.
Finland says it will partially reopen its border with Russia after completely closing it last month. The Vaalimaa and Nirala border points will reopen on Thursday for 1 month, but authorities say they'll close them again at the first sign of what they called manipulated migration. Helsinki has accused Moscow of orchestrating a migration crisis on its doorstep. According to the Finnish authorities, almost 1,000 asylum seekers, mainly from Somalia, Iraq and Yemen, have presented themselves at border crossings between the two countries since the beginning of August.
Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman who died in custody last year, has been awarded the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Human Rights posthumously. Her case made headlines worldwide, causing heavy protests throughout the country and sparking the Women, Life, Freedom movement globally.
Their treatment is another example of what the people of Iran face every day. Let me say that the courage and resilience of Iranian women in their fight for justice, liberty and human rights will not be stopped. Their voices cannot be silenced, and while they are not here today, their presence will be felt.
Amini was arrested for not wearing the Islamic headscarf correctly and ended up dead. The repression of this movement resulted in hundreds of deaths and thousands of arrests. A lawyer of Amini's family says Iran banned them from travelling to France to collect the top prize.
Although it looks like honey, not everything we buy in the supermarket under that name is honey. A rise in adulterated honey has prompted the European Parliament to vote in favour of reforms to its so-called breakfast directives, which aim to ensure clearer labelling on agri-food products. MEPs want products to include what percentage of honey originates in the EU and how much comes from outside the bloc.
Aujourd'hui, on assiste à beaucoup de mélanges où on met du miel venant de pays européens qu'on mélange avec du miel venant de l'extérieur de l'Union européenne qui est produit dans de mauvaises conditions, qui est transformé.
Defying bad weather on Tuesday, the continent's beekeepers travelled to the European Parliament in Strasbourg to demand strict measures. Currently, 46% of honey coming from outside the EU is fraudulent, according to an investigation by the European Anti-Fraud Agency. China, Turkey and the UK are the main exporters of fake honey entering the EU.
Parce que dans le monde, eh bien, il y en a qui ne produisent pas du miel. Ils le fabriquent. C'est pas pareil. Et moi je dis que si l'Europe ne légifère pas actuellement sur la nouvelle directive, avec les pourcentages exacts, tout ce que l'on demande au sein du COPA, eh bien un jour on va aller devant un scandale sanitaire. que c'est plus du sucre qu'ils vont rajouter. Ça va être un autre produit. Et là, ça risque d'être dangereux pour la population.
The adulteration of honey, which includes adding syrups, reduces its price and, according to beekeepers, affects their reputation. It's a situation that complicates the survival of European beekeepers, who see that with climate change it is becoming increasingly difficult to obtain the same amount of honey. The European Parliament will now enter negotiations with EU governments to try and find a common position on the rules.
The main suspects in an attack on a football referee in the Turkish capital Ankara have been arrested. The three men, including a club president, punched a referee in the face at the end of a top-flight match. Following the attack, the Turkish Football Federation suspended all league games in the country.
FIFA kokartlı hakemimiz Halil Meler çok kötü ve insanlık dışı bir saldırıya uğramıştır. Bu saldırıyı şiddetle kınıyoruz. Bu yapılan saldırı Türk futbolu adına maalesef çok şanssız ve utanç gecesi. Türk futbolunun bunları hak etmediğini düşünüyoruz ve artık yeter diyoruz, yeter!
The referee was also kicked on the ground in a scuffle after fans invaded the pitch. Turkey's interior minister visited Halil Meler in the hospital, where he was being treated for a slight fracture near his eye, but was not in a serious condition. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan condemned the attack and wished Meler a speedy recovery.